The transport ship descended through the purple clouds of Nexus. Prime and Commander Velcorin watched it with the same bored expression. It wore every admission cycle. He had served at the Galactic Nexus Academy for 47 years, and he had seen thousands of students come through these crystalline halls. The Academy was the most prestigious institution in the known universe, and only the finest young minds from the Collective's 12 founding species were ever admitted to today's batch. Would be no different from any other. Velcorin glanced at his datapad and scrolled through the list of incoming students. There were Krethver, warriors from the outer colonies, and Velmori nobles from the floating cities of their homeworld. There were Lithoids from the deep mining planets and Delphini from the ocean worlds. And then there was something unusual. A human. Velcorin had to read the entry twice to make sure he was not mistaken. The Academy had never accepted a human before, and, for good reason, humanity was still considered a provisional species in the Galactic Collective. They had only achieved interstellar travel 2 centuries ago, and their technology was primitive compared to even the youngest member species. Their homeworld was classified as a Category 7. Death world with extreme weather patterns and crushing gravity and countless predators. Most galactics considered it a miracle that humans had survived long enough to reach the stars at all. Velcorin pulled up the student file and read through it carefully. Name: Myra Chun, species human from Earth age, 19 standard cycles, admission status, provisional diplomatic courtesy acceptance, a pity admission. Then the council must have approved it as a political gesture to keep the humans happy while the real students learned real skills. Velcorin shook his head and made a note to assign her comfortable quarters near the medical bay. She would need them. The transport doors opened and students began filing out onto the landing platform. The Krethver came first with their 8 feet of height and 4 powerful arms and chitinous armor that could stop a plasma bolt. Behind them came the Velmori with their iridescent wings and delicate features and the cold arrogance of their ancient noble houses. The Lithoids moved slowly and deliberately, and their silicon-based bodies reflected the light of the twin suns. And then at the very end came the human. Myra-chan was small. That was the first thing everyone noticed about her. She stood barely 5.5 feet tall, and she had none of the natural armor or weapons that the other species possessed. Her skin was soft and brown, and her hair was dark and pulled back. In a simple ponytail, her eyes were a warm brown color, and they looked around the crystalline halls with an expression of wonder and curiosity. She looked fragile. She looked weak. She looked like she would break if someone breathed on her too hard. Trixara of House Velmori noticed the human immediately, and she smiled the cold smile of a predator, spotting easy prey. Trixara was a third-year student, and she came from one of the most powerful families in the collective. She had iridescent wings that shifted between blue and purple and gold, and she carried herself with the absolute confidence of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. She also had a reputation for cruelty that made even the instructors nervous. Trixara glided over to where Myra was standing, and she looked down at the human with undisguised contempt. "You must be the human," Trixara said, and her voice was sweet, and the way that poison was sweet. "I am," Myra replied, and she smiled politely at the Velmori noble. "I am Mira Chun, and it is nice to meet you." Several other students had gathered around to watch the interaction, and they snickered at the human's simple greeting. "How adorable," Trixara said, and she exchanged amused glances with her companions. "I do hope they have assigned you comfortable quarters, because you will be spending most of your time there recovering from everything." "What do you mean?" Myra asked. "The Academy's training is legendary," Trixara explained with false concern. "It is designed to push the galaxy's strongest species to their absolute limits, and I'm afraid that humans are not exactly known for their physical capabilities. I have heard the training is difficult," Myra admitted, "but I am sure I will manage." The Velmori laughed, and it was a beautiful sound that was also somehow cruel managed. Trixara repeated, "Oh, you sweet primitive thing, you have no idea what you have gotten yourself into." She spread her wings slightly in a display of dominance. "The combat assessments alone will probably put you in the medical bay for a week, and the endurance trials have broken students from species that make yours look like insects." Myra said nothing, and she just kept smiling that same polite smile. "My advice," Trixara continued, and she leaned in close. "Go home now while you still can walk and tell your little planet that you tried your best, but the galaxy was simply too much for your kind." There was a long moment of silence, and everyone waited to see how the human would react. Would she cry and run away like the weak creature she obviously was? Would she get angry and make a fool of herself? Mira-chan did neither. She simply looked up at the towering Velmori with those warm brown eyes, and she spoke in a calm and steady voice. "Thank you for your concern," she said, "but I think I will stay and see what happens." Trixara blinked in surprise, and for just a moment, something flickered across her face that might have been uncertainty. Then she laughed again and waved a dismissive hand. "Suit yourself, human, but do not say I did not warn you." She turned and glided away with her companions following behind her, and their laughter echoed through the crystalline halls. Mira watched them go, and then she picked up her small bag and walked toward the registration center. Commander Velkorin had observed the entire exchange from a distance, and he found himself frowning slightly. There was something about the human that did not quite fit his expectations. She had not been intimidated by Trixara's display. She had not been upset by the mockery of the other students. She had simply stood there with that calm smile and that steady voice, and she had refused to be moved. It was strange. It was probably nothing. But Velkorin made a mental note to keep an eye on the human during the first trials. If nothing else, it might be interesting to see exactly how long she lasted before the academy broke her. He gave it 1 week at most. After all, she was only human. The first week at the academy was designed to break the week. Every new student knew this, and every new student thought they were prepared for it. They were wrong. The instructors were veterans of a dozen wars, and they had no patience for weakness or excuses or failure. They pushed each student to their absolute limits, and then they pushed them further. Combat assessments came first, and they were brutal. Endurance tests came next, and they were worse. Cognitive examinations lasted 30 hours without rest, and they crushed the minds of even the strongest students. By the end of the first week, half of every new class was usually begging to go home. This year was no different, except for one small detail. The human had not broken yet. Myra Chun arrived at the combat arena on the third day, and she found herself facing a Krethver named Gorath. Gorath was 8 feet tall, and he had 4 arms covered in natural armor that could deflect blade strikes. His mandibles clicked with anticipation as he looked down at the tiny human standing across from him. "This is a joke," he said, and his voice rumbled like distant thunder. "They expect me to fight this soft little creature." The other students gathered around the arena, and they laughed and placed bets on how quickly the human would fall. Most of them gave her 30 seconds at most. The rules are simple. The combat instructor announced, "Fight until one opponent yields or is unable to continue, and lethal force is prohibited, but injuries are expected." Gorath cracked all 4 of his knuckles, and the sound was like rocks breaking. "I will try not to hurt you too badly, little human," he said. "I would hate to end your academy career on the first week." Mira said nothing, and she simply settled into a fighting stance that none of the observers recognized. It looked primitive and inefficient, and several students laughed at the sight. The horn sounded, and Gorath charged. He moved fast for a creature his size, and his 4 arms reached out to grab the human and crush her into submission. But Mira was not there. She had moved at the last possible moment, and she slipped under. His arms like water flowing around a stone. Gorath spun around in confusion, and he swung again with all 4 fists. Mira ducked under two of them and deflected a third, as she landed a sharp kick to the back of his knee that made him stumble. Dottore! Laughter stopped. Gorath roared in frustration, and he attacked again with more force and more speed. And again, Mira was not where he expected her to be. She moved around him constantly, and she never stayed in one place for more than a second. She did not try to match his strength because she knew she could not. Instead, she used his own momentum against him, and she made him chase her and swing at empty air. Every time he overextended, she was there to strike at his joints and his vulnerable points. Every time he tried to corner her, she slipped away like smoke. The fight lasted 47 minutes. 47 minutes of constant movement and constant attacks and constant evasion. Gorath was covered in bruises and small cuts from dozens of precise strikes. His breathing was ragged and his arms were shaking with exhaustion. He had never fought anyone for this long in his entire life. Finally, his legs gave out, and he collapsed to the arena floor. "What are you?" he gasped as he looked up at the human standing over him. Mira was breathing hard and sweat was dripping down her face. She looked exhausted, but she was still standing. Tired, she admitted, but not done. The arena was completely silent as everyone stared at the impossible scene before them. The soft little human had just defeated a HFY warrior through sheer endurance. It should not have been possible, and yet it had happened. The endurance trial came 3 days later, and it was even more revealing. Students were dropped into a simulated, hostile environment with toxic atmosphere and extreme temperatures and uneven terrain. They had to march across 200 miles of brutal landscape, and the last one standing would be declared. The winner, the Velmori, dropped out within hours because their delicate wings could not handle the ground-based movement. The Delphini required constant hydration breaks, and they fell behind quickly. Even the mighty HFY began to slow down as the hours stretched into days. But Mira-chan kept walking. She walked through blistering heat and freezing cold. She walked through poisonous fog that made her cough and wheeze. She walked on feet that were blistered and bleeding inside her boots. She walked for 3 days straight without stopping. When the instructors finally called the trial because the simulation limits had been reached, they found Mira still moving forward. She was swaying on her feet, and her eyes were glazed with exhaustion. But she was still going. "How is this possible?" demanded the chief instructor as medical teams rushed to attend to the students. Her species has no enhanced endurance capabilities, and no redundant organ systems, and no natural resistance to environmental hazards. Commander Velkorin had been watching the trial results with growing disbelief, and he pulled up the human database to search for answers. What he found made him sit down heavily in his chair. "They are persistence predators," he said quietly. "What does that mean?" asked the instructor. "It means that on their homeworld, humans hunted by chasing their prey until it died of exhaustion." Velkorin explained. "They do not have claws or fangs or venom, and so they evolved to simply keep going long after everything else had stopped. That is insane. That is humanity." Velkorin looked at the medical readout from Mira-chan, and he saw that her body had been pumping chemicals into her bloodstream to suppress pain. An enhanced focus. Adrenaline, they called it. It was a natural combat drug that her species produced internally whenever they faced danger or stress. He had underestimated her. They all had, and he was beginning to suspect that this was only the beginning. By the second month, the whispers had spread through every corridor of the academy. The human was not normal. Something was wrong with her. Something was terrifying. It started with small observations that students shared in nervous voices when they thought no one important was listening. Trixara gathered a group of her companions in the common room one evening, and she spoke in a hushed tone that was very different from her usual arrogant voice. "She does not sleep properly," Trixar reported. "I had my servants monitor her quarters for a week, and she only rests for 6 hours at a time." "That cannot be right," said a lithoid named Corvin. Cognitive function would degrade within days without proper hibernation cycles. She has been doing it her entire life. Trixara said. They all do it, and humans do not hibernate at all, and they just have these short rest periods every single night. And then they wake up and function normally. Every night, asked the Delphiny student with horror in her voice. How? Are their brains not destroyed? I do not know, but it gets worse. The revelations kept coming as the weeks passed, and each one was more disturbing than the last. In xenobiology class, the instructor asked students to describe their homeworlds, and Mira casually mentioned that Earth had a gravitational pull that was 1.4 times the galactic standard. The entire class went silent. You grew up in heavy gravity? The instructor asked. I suppose so, Myra said with a shrug. I never really thought about it, but everything here does feel a bit lighter than home. The Academy's artificial gravity was specifically calibrated to challenge students and make training more difficult, and the human thought it felt light. In chemistry class, there was an accident when a student knocked over a container of reactive compounds. A toxic cloud began spreading through the laboratory, and the evacuation alarms sounded immediately. Students rushed for the exits, but a young Velmori had collapsed near the back of the room, and the gas was already reaching dangerous concentrations. Mira ran back into the cloud. She held her breath, and she grabbed the unconscious Velmori and she dragged them to safety. It took her 4 minutes to get out, 4 minutes without breathing. The medical staff were stunned when they examined her afterward. How did you survive that? Demanded the physician. I just held my breath, Myra said. Humans can do that for a few minutes if we have to. A few minutes without oxygen and you suffer no brain damage. Well, I would not want to do it regularly, but in an emergency, we can manage. The physician made notes with trembling hands, and he added another entry to the growing file on human capabilities. The xenobiology lessons became increasingly disturbing as the semester continued. One day, the instructor was explaining immune systems and how different species fought off infections and diseases. When it was Myra's turn to describe the human immune system, the entire class listened with growing horror. Our bodies have specialized cells that identify and destroy foreign invaders, Myra explained. White blood cells and antibodies and things like that. That is fairly standard, the instructor said. What happens when these systems are overwhelmed? Well, sometimes we get a fever. Explain what that means. Our body temperature rises to kill the infection, Myra said. The heat makes it harder for the disease to survive, so our immune system deliberately raises our internal temperature. The instructor leaned forward with wide eyes. You are telling me that your body will increase its own temperature to lethal levels in order to destroy an invader? Sometimes yes. And you survive this process? Usually, Myra said. Sometimes we take medicine to bring the fever down, but my grandmother always said you should let it run its course. If it is not too high. A Velmori student stood up and left the room with their wings trembling. 2 more followed shortly. After, your immune system will cook you alive from the inside, the instructor said slowly, just to kill a disease. I never really thought of it that way, but I suppose so. And your grandmother, who apparently endorsed this practice, lived how long? She died when she was 87, Myra said. She worked as a nurse and she was on her feet for 12-hour shifts until she was 70 years old. The silence in the classroom was absolute. That night, Commander Velcorin called an emergency meeting of the senior faculty. We need to discuss the human situation, he said. What situation? Asked the combat instructor. She is performing adequately in all assessments. That is exactly the situation, Velcorin replied. I have been researching human biology and history, and I believe we have made a critical error in our classification of their species. He pulled up a holographic display showing Earth and its many dangers extreme. Temperature variations that range from frozen wastelands to burning deserts, tectonic instability that caused earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions, massive storms that could level entire cities, predators that had been hunting humans for millions of years. We classified Earth as a Category 7 death world. Valkoran said, but we assumed that meant humans were weak, survivors who had barely escaped extinction. And what do you believe now? Asked the xenobiology instructor. I believe we had it backward, Valkoran said. Humans did not survive there. Death world by hiding from it, and they conquered it through sheer stubborn refusal to die. He changed the display to show human history. Wars that had killed millions, plagues that had wiped out entire continents, ice ages and famines and disasters. That should have ended their species 100 times over, and through all of it humanity had kept going. They are not fragile survivors. Valkoran said quietly, they are apex predators from a world that tried to kill them every single day. And we let one into our academy. We did, and I think we should all be very grateful that she seems to be friendly. The Galactic Nexus Academy had stood for 10,000 years. It had survived wars and natural disasters and political upheavals that had toppled entire civilizations. Its defenses were legendary, and its walls had never been breached. The Void Syndicate did not care about history. They were the most ruthless criminal organization in the galaxy, and they wanted something that the Academy had in abundance. Hostages, the students of the Academy came from the most powerful families in the collective, and their ransoms would make the Syndicate rich beyond imagination. The attack came in the middle of the night cycle, when most students were in their quarters. The Academy's energy shields fell first, and they went down so quickly that the security teams barely had time to register the failure. Automated defense systems went dark a moment later, and the backup generators were somehow disabled before they could activate. Within minutes, 100 armed raiders had breached the outer walls, and they were moving through the corridors with brutal efficiency. Students were dragged from their beds and forced to their knees in the central courtyard. Security officers who tried to resist were stunned and bound alongside their charges. By the time Commander Valkoran realized what was happening, his own office was surrounded. He was escorted to the courtyard with the others, and he saw the scope of the disaster immediately. Nearly 200 students had been captured, and they were kneeling in rows with their hands bound behind their backs. Armed Syndicate soldiers stood guard with weapons drawn, and their leader was pacing in front of the prisoners with a cruel smile on his scarred face. The commander was a Krethver mercenary named Torax, and he had a reputation for violence that made even hardened criminals nervous. Nobody plays hero. Torax announced to the assembled students, "We want ransoms, not corpses, and if you cooperate, then you will all be returned to your families once payment is received." He walked along the rows of prisoners, and he enjoyed the fear in their eyes. "But if anyone tries anything stupid, then I will make an example of them, and trust me when I say that you do not want to see what that looks like." The students were silent and terrified, and nobody dared to move. And then Torax noticed something strange. One of the prisoners was not kneeling. A small figure was still standing near the back of the group, and she was looking at the armed soldiers with an expression that Torax did not recognize. It was the human. "You there?" Torax called out. "Did you not hear me and I said everyone on their knees?" Myra Chun did not move. She just stood there with that strange expression, and her eyes were scanning the courtyard, like she was calculating something. "I will not ask again." Torax growled, and he started walking toward her. "Kneel, or I will break your legs and make you kneel." "No," Myra said. Her voice was calm and steady, and it carried across the silent courtyard. Torax stopped, and he stared at her with disbelief. Nobody had ever refused him before. Nobody had ever been stupid enough to try. "What did you say to me?" he demanded. "I said no." Myra repeated, "I am not going to kneel for you." Torax laughed, and it was an ugly sound. "Do you know who I am, little creature? And do you know what I have done to people who defied me? I do not care." Something changed. In the courtyard at that moment, the other students were staring at Myra with a mixture of horror and fascination. The Syndicate soldiers were exchanging uncertain glances, and Torax was starting to feel something he had not felt in a very long time. He was starting to feel doubt. "Take her down," he ordered. 3 soldiers moved toward Myra with stun weapons raised. What happened next would be studied at military academies across the galaxy for the next 1,000 years. Myra moved before the soldiers could fire, and she was faster than anyone expected. She grabbed the nearest soldier, and she used his own momentum to throw him into his companions. The stun weapon discharged harmlessly into the air, and Myra caught it before it hit the ground. She fired twice, and 2 soldiers went down. Then she was moving again, and she was a blur of motion that the others could barely track. She did not fight like the Academy taught. She fought like something older and more primal. She broke bones with her bare hands. She used fallen weapons and pieces of debris as improvised clubs. When a soldier got too close, she gouged at his eyes and struck at his throat. It was brutal and savage and utterly terrifying. Torax roared orders, and more soldiers rushed toward the human. They shot her in the shoulder, and she kept coming. They shot her in the leg, and she kept coming. They backed her into a corner, and she fought harder, because this was what humans were. They were the descendants of creatures who had fought predators 10 times their size. They had survived ice ages and supervolcanoes and plagues that should have wiped them out. They had climbed to the top of their planet's food chain through sheer bloody-minded refusal to die. Myra-chan was afraid. She was bleeding from 3 bullet wounds, and her left arm hung useless at her side. Every breath was agony, and her vision was starting to blur at the edges. But fear had never stopped a human before. She kept fighting 15 minutes. That was how long she held the central corridor, while the remaining security teams regrouped and coordinated a counterattack. 15 minutes against trained killers with only improvised weapons and a body that was slowly failing. When reinforcements finally breached the courtyard, they found chaos. Half of the Syndicate soldiers were unconscious or disabled. Torax himself was lying on the ground with his jaw broken and his arms bent at unnatural angles. And Myra-chan was still standing over him. She was swaying on her feet, and her face was pale from blood loss, but she was standing medical. She said, and her voice was barely a whisper, "The others need medical attention." Then her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed. Commander Velcorin caught her before she hit the ground, and he looked down at the small human in his arms with something very close to awe. She weighed almost nothing, and she had just saved 200 students from the most dangerous criminal organization in the galaxy. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session 3 days after the attack on the Academy. Representatives from all 12 founding species gathered in the Great Chamber, and the tension in the room was unlike anything anyone had seen in decades. The attack itself was an outrage that demanded immediate response. But that was not why the council had gathered so urgently. They had gathered to discuss the human. "Let me make sure I understand the reports correctly," said High Counselor Zenth of the Zenthari. A single human student with no military training and no enhanced capabilities somehow defeated over 30 armed Syndicate operatives. "That is correct," Commander Velcorin replied. He stood in the center of the chamber with a holographic display showing the security footage from that night. Myra-chan engaged the enemy for approximately 15 minutes, and she neutralized 19 soldiers, including the Syndicate commander, before our security teams could mount a response. "How is that possible?" demanded the Krethver representative. "Humans are classified as a category 3 species with minimal physiological advantages. I believe that classification was in error," Velcorin said. He changed the display to show Myra's medical report. During the engagement, she sustained 3 projectile wounds and a broken arm and severe blood loss that would have incapacitated a Valmori within minutes. And yet she continued fighting. She did not stop until every other student was safe. The chamber fell silent as the representative studied the medical data. Her body was producing massive quantities of adrenaline and endorphins. Velkorin continued. These are natural chemicals that humans generate under extreme stress, and they suppress pain and enhance physical performance and allow them to continue functioning long past the point where their bodies should have failed. They drug themselves? Asked the Delphini representative with horror. Involuntarily, yes, and it is an automatic response that evolved on their death world. Velkorin pulled up a new display showing Earth and its history. We have fundamentally misunderstood what humans are, he said. We looked at their soft bodies and their lack of natural weapons, and we assumed they were weak survivors who had barely escaped their dangerous home world. And what do you believe now? Asked High Counselor Zenth. I believe they are the most dangerous species we have ever encountered. The statement sent murmurs rippling through the chamber. Consider their history. Velkorin continued. They evolved on a planet that was actively trying to kill them every single day, and they had no claws or fangs or armor, so they developed something far more terrifying. He showed images of early humans hunting animals that were many times their size. They became persistent predators, and they would chase their prey for days without stopping until the animal collapsed from exhaustion. They developed tools and weapons that let them kill creatures 100 times their strength. They survived ice ages by covering themselves in the skins of their kills and burning dead. Plants for warmth. They split the atom because they were curious about what would happen. They went to their moon in ships made of metal and fuel and sheer stubborn determination. The chamber was completely silent now. Myra Chun did not survive because she was stronger than the Syndicate. Valkorn said, she survived because humans do not know how to quit. They are a species that crawled out of the mud and looked at the stars and said, mine. They are a species that has never in their entire history accepted that something was impossible. He paused and he looked around at the assembled representatives. And I believe the collective should be very grateful that they want to be our friends. High Counselor Zenth was quiet for a long moment. What do you recommend? She finally asked. I recommend that we immediately upgrade humanity's classification to a founding species. Velkorn said, I recommend that we increase our diplomatic engagement with Earth, and I recommend that we never ever make them angry. The council voted unanimously in favor of all three recommendations. Meanwhile, in the Academy's medical bay, Myra Chun was finally waking up. Her arm was encased in a regeneration cast, and her wounds were healing faster than the doctors had expected. Because of course they were, she opened her eyes, and she was surprised to see Trixara sitting beside her bed. The Vomori noble looked different somehow. The cold arrogance was gone from her expression, and in its place was something that might have been shame. I wanted to apologize, Trixara said quietly, for how I treated you when you first arrived and for everything I said about your species. You do not have to apologize, Myra said. Yes, I do. Trixara insisted. I thought you were weak because you were small and soft and fragile. I am weak, Myra said with a small smile. Compared to most species here, I am practically made of paper. But you did not stop. No, Myra agreed, we never do. She sat up slowly and winced at the pain in her ribs. My grandmother used to tell me stories about our ancestors. She said, they crossed frozen wastelands with nothing but fur and fire. They sailed across oceans that could swallow them in an instant. They climbed mountains that should have been impossible. And when the universe told them no, they just kept going until they found a way to say yes. Trixara was silent for a moment. I think I finally understand. She said, your strength is not in your bodies. It never was. Myra said, our strength is that we refuse to accept defeat, even when defeat is the only logical outcome. That is terrifying. I know, Myra said with a grin. Why do you think the universe keeps trying to kill us? When Myra returned to classes the following week, nobody called her the human anymore. They called her by her name, and when the Academy's ancient halls filled with new students the next cycle, including for the first time a full delegation from Earth, they told stories about Myra Chun, the girl who was not normal, the girl who had reminded the entire galaxy that the most dangerous thing in the universe was not the strongest or the fastest or the smartest. It was the one that simply refused to give up. Commander Velcorin watched the new human students arrive, and he smiled at the familiar expressions of wonder on their faces. They looked small and soft and fragile, just like Myra had looked, and just like Mira, they would surprise everyone, because that was what humans did. They showed up where they were not expected. They survived what should have killed them, and they made the impossible look easy. The galaxy would never be the same, and Velcorin suspected that was exactly what humanity had intended all along.